Good morning. So, in my office, on the monitor of my computer, there's a sticky note that my wife asked me to put there. And it says simply, "Where are the women?" And it's there because partly because we're in Luke this year, and Luke is the gospel that emphasizes women, and partly because just so often they aren't there at all. Which, by the way, reminds me that next week, as Corey mentioned, is Mother's Day, and I'm recruiting for people to speak next week. It's 3 or 4 women want to speak next week about Mother's Day. I don't want to speak next week about Mother's Day because we should hear from women next week. So anyway, I'm recruiting. But anyway, so this note, right, and this "where are the women," and it's just, again, so glaring in our passage this morning, right? We just did Easter, and the women see Jesus for the first time, and the men are not sure, but, at least the women get to, they're the first witnesses to the resurrection, and now here we are at, 2 weeks later, and we get this story, and it's just guys. And where are the women in this story? And the answer is they're just in the background somewhere. And that's a really important note for me because the story itself is so interesting. There's so much backstory. And so it'd be so easy just to forget the women in this story because they're just not there, and the story itself is so great. So let me show you, okay? So that we start out this story in chapter 21, verse 1, with Jesus and the disciples, and they're on the shore of something here called the Sea of Tiberias. Now this is the same, actually it's just a small lake, and it's usually called the Sea of Galilee. But for whatever reason, John here calls it the Sea of Tiberias. Now John is usually not a very political gospel. He usually doesn't talk so much about the politics of things, depending on your interpretation of things. But here you have this very political statement because this is the Sea of Galilee, which is named after the region of Galilee. Perfectly good, logical sort of name. And then the Romans showed up, and we get this new emperor whose name is Tiberius, and the local governor of the region, the local kinglet, he decides he's going to call this Tiberius after the new emperor so he can get a little bit of, extra money, or have to send a little extra money, is less money. Right? He's hoping to get something out of this. Right? So there's the Romans sort of stamping their authority on the region, and there's a Sea of Tiberias, and there's a brand new city called Tiberias. I can imagine this, like it's like the local kinglet decides new city right there, and they build it. And they actually have to go out and haul people in to live there because it had no actual purpose for being. Right? So anyway, so a little bit of politics in here. And then we get to the names of the disciples. And so we have a Simon Peter story. There's lots of backstory to Simon Peter. We could spend all day on Simon's backstory. But then there's also Thomas, who's called the twin. And so part of the backstory that's not there is that part of church history says, the twin, that's a very unusual thing in the ancient world because twins often didn't survive. And so you have someone called the twin, and people go, wonder whose twin he is. Wonder if he's Jesus' twin. No way to know, right? He's right? But this is also the Thomas, probably not, right? But it's a story that people, people tell. Anyway, so then there's this, right? This is also the Thomas who was the doubting Thomas. So if you know the doubting Thomas story, this is that Thomas. But this is also the Thomas in John's Gospel, where when Jesus is heading toward Jerusalem, this is the Thomas who said, let's go with him to die with him. This is brave Thomas, at least brave in words, right? And now he's standing there before Jesus who died, and he recognizes that, well, I sort of ran away, right? So this is also might be a bit embarrassed Thomas, besides doubting Thomas, or a bit nervous Thomas about it. So what do you say now? Okay, so lots of backstory. Nathaniel, right? So this is the Nathaniel from Galilee, and this is sort of the call story of Nathaniel. And right, so Jesus said, this is a true Israelite, in him there is no deceit. So that's that from Nathaniel. Then Nathaniel is said to be here from Cana, a new idea here. And Cana links us back to the wedding in Cana. Right? And Jesus making all the wine. This is his first big son. Right? So this is the way this story goes on. Right? And the assumption by this writer is that you sort of know all this backstory because it's at the end of the story. And again, it's not even that straightforward, because one of the odd things about the Gospel of John is that the Gospel of John has a very consistent style and very consistent vocabulary, but it's also clearly also a composite gospel. It doesn't flow well. Right? So if you look at the end of chapter 20, you have what is in the gospel a perfectly good ending. Clearly at some point somebody ended at 20, and then somebody tacked on 21 in exactly the same style. Right? So so you have this consistency of form. So there's lots and lots of things to talk about. And finally we get to a where is the women part of the story. Or at least a clear where is the women part, because these guys are sitting around, right, talking about stuff, and Peter says, I'm going fishing. Right? Time to go and do something useful for a change. And here's a good where's the women part, I think, because the women have never stopped. Because these guys, they've been eating this whole time. And they haven't been cooking for themselves. And their kids have been eating this whole time. And the women have come back from Passover, and the fields have needed work, and that, back in those days, was mostly women's work. Right? And the kids have needed feeding, and that was women's work. And so the women didn't have this choice, about I'm going back to work. Because the moment you stop feeding kids, they start crying. And I guess you can choose to ignore them, but that doesn't go very well for very long. Right? So, the women in the story, they've been busy the whole time. And finally the guys decide they're going to do something. Simon Peter says, I'm going fishing. And he goes out there. And we have an interesting group here. We don't know anything about Thomas and where he's from. Nathaniel is from Cana in Galilee, so he's a landlubber. He has no idea how to fish. And there's nothing more annoying than you got a whole bunch of people going fishing and you got some guy in the boat who has no idea what he's doing. Especially if you're using nets and things like that, right? There's a rhythm to all of this. There's a method to all of this. It's not like, well, you take this rod and go cast over there and don't try to hook anybody. It's like, well, we're all supposed to be doing this together. We got one idiot there who just has no idea what he's doing, and he's just in the way the whole time. So anyway, he's going fishing. And then suddenly we have this new character in there. Oh yeah, earlier, I missed somebody. I missed the sons of Zebedee. So the sons of Zebedee are there, but not named. So who knows the names of the sons of Zebedee?
James and John.
James and John. But neither James or John are ever named in the Gospel of John. When they're there, it's just the sons of Zebedee. Right? Don't know their mother's name. She's not mentioned either. So we got another where's the women, right? Another where's Waldo sort of part of this. Right? And so James and John are never mentioned, and people say, well, it's because John wrote this and he's being humble. Right? So he never puts himself in the story. Except when we get to verse 7, we have this disciple who just sort of appears at the end of the gospel, and he's called the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is a very strange phrase. The disciple whom Jesus loved. What did Jesus think about the rest of his disciples? Did he just sort of like them a lot? Right? And then people say, well, because that's John again. And well, if this is John, then he's just lost all of his humility points, totally. Right? It's like, if you describe yourself as, I'm a member of the Church of the Brethren, and I'm the one that God loves. Yeah, that doesn't win you any humility points. It's just like, wow, that's how you think of yourself? So anyway, this disciple, who again is never named, right? He has this idea, right? Jesus, that's Jesus over there. And then Simon Peter jumps in the water. Except that there's a funny little note here, right? He puts on some clothes, for he was naked. how many of you ever seen, like, many of us grew up in Sunday school, right, with these pictures of the disciples out fishing. How many of you ever seen a picture of the disciples out fishing where none of them are wearing clothes? I mean, you have.
Well, I mean, I've seen pictures of fishermen wearing, like, they wear like these little, like, breechcloth things. Like, it's pretty scanty, though.
It's pretty scanty, okay. But
Swimsuit.
okay, but not like naked.
Yeah.
Okay. Why is he naked? Think really practically.
So he doesn't get his clothes wet?
Yeah, well, wet and
Dirt, fishes.
yeah. Like how many pieces of clothing, how many changes of clothing do you think Peter owns? Possibly one. So what's his wife going to think if every time he goes out fishing he comes back smelling that badly? So instead of putting up with that hassle every time, he just folds them up, puts them in the, puts them over there in the boat, away from everything, covers them up with something, right? And then you go fishing, and then you get back, you jump in the water, you get clean, and then you put on your clothes and you go home and your wife will talk to you. There's a reward to this. I think it's an entirely practical idea. Don't get them torn that way. And this, it's a bunch of guys in a boat.
He does not apply this to his handyman business. His handyman clothes.
Yeah. Well, you're not alone in the boat. So anyway, right? So we got all these little bits of backstory that are potentially very interesting. And then, like I think the most curious verse is verse 12, where it says, "Now none of the disciples dared ask him, 'Who are you?' because they knew it was the Lord." Well, what does that mean? They knew it was the Lord, but apparently they couldn't tell by looking at him. They knew it was Jesus. They didn't see it was Jesus. What is that? Like if you were filming that, how do you even depict that? I don't know.
You can tell by the glow around his head.
Yeah, the little glow around his head, right? But the rest of him doesn't look Jesus-ish. I don't know. Suddenly, I don't know, maybe suddenly he's blonde, right? I don't know. He shaved. That's it. So anyway, we get finally then, after all of this, fun little backstory, to the more sermon-y part of all of this, where Jesus asks Simon Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yep." And Jesus says, his first priority, feed my lambs. So as I was thinking about, there's so many sermons buried in here. If you read this like a preacher does, there's just sermons all over. I've just sort of skipped 10 sermons as we've been going through this. But this one was just, and it fit again so well with the "Where are the women" reminder that I have there. Because the first priority that Jesus has for Peter is feed my lambs. Feed the little ones. That's the first priority. And that's not the way we do things. My second job is as a handyman, where I go and fix stuff. Sinks and toilets and walls and switches and all sorts of stuff like that. My daughter has a job where she tends lambs, children. And she tends to serve children. And it's hard work physically. And it's hard work emotionally. And it takes lots of patience, and it takes lots of training. And it's far more demanding than my handyman job is. But I make way more money than she does. I make triple what she does on a bad day. So clearly we live in a society in which feed my lambs is not number one priority. Feed my lambs, right? Babysitting. How well does babysitting pay? Right? Guys make way more money cutting grass than girls do babysitting, because grass is way more important than kids. And honestly, the same is true in church. The person you pay is the person who stands up here and goes blah, blah, blah. Right? But the ones who do kids Sunday school, well, it's just a volunteer job. Anybody can do that. So we don't, like this. And so this is why we need to keep reading this stuff, because we need to keep reminding ourselves that we're supposed to be doing this all backwards. That doing things backwards is the core of the gospel. That we start with a priority of feed my lambs. The adults, second and third priority. And even then, tend to my sheep is more important than feed my sheep. They can feed themselves. Taking care of one another is more important. So if the early church had taken this passage seriously, then the question I asked initially of where are the women in the passages would have been answered, because they would have been all over. Because they were tending the lambs the entire time while the guys were out going blah, blah, blah. And if the modern church took this more seriously, we'd spend a lot less time defending patriarchy and a lot more time just taking care of the kids and honoring those who take care of the kids and giving a lot less honor to those of us who stand up and go blah, blah, blah and attend committee meetings. Because, let's face it, it's just committee meetings. So it's this challenge of constantly reorienting ourselves. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a thing where let's establish a committee to do this. And who wants to be on the committee? Me neither. Right? But we need to constantly remind ourselves that feed my lambs, first priority. We'll get the other stuff later. So we are at communion again. Right? And where are the women continues in communion. Because traditionally, again, this has been a guy thing. Women are allowed to partake in communion. Lambs? Not usually. And so come on up. Come and join me. Again, traditionally,